I went to a Japanese convenience store for the first time in my life with a Japanese friend a few years ago on a trip to Japan. After we paid for our stuff, we turned around and began to leave. But in the corner of my eyes, I saw the cashier starting to bow to us while saying something like,
ありがとうございました。
Since I was unfamiliar with Japanese customs, I looked to my Japanese friend for what to do in pretty much all social situations. But in this case, my friend just kept walking. And that made me very uncomfortable. I didn't want to be rude in Japan of all places. So I nudged my friend and said, hey, I think that cashier just bowed to us. Shouldn't we stop and bow back or something? And my friend looked at me as if I just said something crazy and said, no. Why? I learned a few things that day. First of all, as a customer in Japan, you are actually supposed to walk away from the establishment like a king while the staff are bowing to you behind your back. Secondly, it sucks to be the cashier. I mean, customers don't have eyes on the back of their head. They can't see you bow most of the time, and yet you still have to perform this extra piece of emotional and physical labor when there is no one to see it. Now, some of this has to do with the fact that Japan just has a deeply rooted culture of respect. But in the case of the cashiers, they are explicitly instructed to bow to customers as they leave, regardless of whether the customers can see it. And that is, in fact, a microcosm of a series of cultural dynamics that make Japan one of the best places to live, but perhaps one of the worst places to work. To be more specific, I mean that Japan is a great place to spend money, but a terrible place to make money. To put it simply, it's great to be the customer, but it sucks to be the cashier. As a consumer in Japan, you are receiving one of the best services in the world, essentially being treated like royalties. But someone has to put in tremendous efforts to maintain this perfection you experience as a customer. And that someone are the people who work in Japan. They're the ones who are going the extra mile to bow even when no one is looking to maintain this appearance of perfection. In this video, I'm going to discuss Japanese work culture, not just about what it is, but also how it is changing. And it is changing in recent years, especially with the introduction of Gen Zs in the workplace. But before we get there, we need to understand what the traditional Japanese work culture is like. And that culture is characterized by rigid hierarchical structures and deference to authority and seniority. For example, instead of voicing their opinions and contributing to the conversation, employees tend to defer to their boss's opinions when the team is making decisions. Additionally, promotions and salary increase are often based just as much on performance as the length of time one has worked at the company. This results in companies that are good at keeping the status quo but otherwise lack innovation and slow adapting to change. This is a problem in the 21st century given how fast the world is changing. And this is why Japan is lagging behind in tech and more specifically in the recent development of AI. Company loyalty is also a key part of Japanese work culture, with employees typically expected to work for one company for their entire lives. This is in stark contrast with the Western work culture, where the idea of changing companies once every 2 to 3 years is not only not frowned upon, but also sometimes encouraged explicitly as a career strategy to acquire more experience, skills, opportunities, and higher pay. But in Japan, as a result of the collectivist culture, the career prospect of any one specific employee is considered secondary to the well-being of the company. In fact, the employees are culturally encouraged to sacrifice their personal lives and career advancement to the company's future. That cultural attitude is a major contributor to overwork in Japan. Now, overwork occurs everywhere in the world, but most of the time it happens as a result of practical and economic reasons. Typically, we've got employees who want to get the raise and the promotion or fear losing their job, so they work longer hours to achieve those things. And these economic factors exist for Japanese employees as well. But in Japan, there's also an additional factor, that is this cultural ideal of employees sacrificing their personal well-being for the company. Conforming to the group is another important reason. For example, when a Japanese employee sees that everyone else is working overtime, he or she feels pressure to do so as well, or they feel ashamed to leave early So they will stay late at the office even if they don't have any more work to do. In other words, a lot of employees are staying late at the office because they feel culturally obligated to stay, not because there is actually an overwhelming amount of work to be done. Then what are they doing in the office, you might ask? Well, similar to the convenience store cashier that bows behind customers' back when no one is there to see it, office workers are often busy keeping up the appearance of being busy. One can argue that it is even worse for the office workers because in the case of the cashier, at least her bowing is creating an appearance of excellent customer service. Even if the customer who's walking away can't see it, other customers who are waiting in line potentially can. So their effort isn't completely pointless. But in the case of office workers, they're potentially sacrificing their personal time at the office pretending to work for really no reason at all, but the fact that it is socially unacceptable to leave. And even when there is a lot of real work to do, this overtime isn't productive. For example, it is unlikely that the average office employee maintain peak cognitive performance during the entire 80 hours of overtime they are spending at the office. In fact, studies have shown that cognitive performance declines sharply after just 50 to 55 hours per week. Just to drive this point home, Japan has had the lowest productivity amongst all G7 nations for 50 straight years, according to Nippon.com, which is quite impressive. And in addition to overtime, employees are sometimes expected to go out for drinks after work. This kind of work event is called nomikai and occurs quite frequently in Japanese companies. It's meant as an opportunity for coworkers to bond as a team, although I'm not sure how much fun one can have with their colleagues and bosses after having just spent 14 pointless hours with them in the office. But regardless of your personal feelings towards those social events, you're culturally pressured to attend anyway. And this cultural theme of putting the company's benefits above your own is all well and good if the companies are doing the same in return for you. But that is not often the case. In fact, some companies intentionally abuse this cultural trait to take advantage of their workers. These companies are known as black companies in Japan. Now, exploitative companies exist all over the world, but most of the time, they get away with it using economic leverage. For example, the workers don't have money, therefore don't have any other options but to put up with the company's exploitative practices. The Japanese black companies use economic leverage as well, but they also use the invisible leverage of culture. That is, they take full advantage of Japan's deeply ingrained work culture to push employees to extreme limits by enforcing long hours, unpaid overtime, and harsh working conditions, all while using cultural expectations of loyalty and self-sacrifice to keep workers compliant. Employees at black companies often work well beyond 80 hours per week, sometimes resulting in death. This kind of death is called karoshi, death by overwork, where employees suffer from fatal strokes, heart attacks, or even take their own lives due to extreme stress. Now, fortunately, this culture is changing, especially as a result of the recent influx of Gen Zs entering the workforce. Japanese Gen Zs, like those of most parts of the developed world, are digital natives. They're very much used to having information and these digital extensions of themselves online that are instantly accessible through the devices in their pockets. As such, one can say that they are raised partly by the Japanese cultural environment, which can be rigid, but also partly by the internet, which is incredibly fluid. As a result, they're not quite the same as their older generational counterparts. For instance, they seem to be more individualistic when it comes to work, in the sense that they don't seem super enthusiastic about this idea of putting the company's well-being above their own. After all, if companies, as the employer, can so readily lay off its workforce during an economic downturn, Gen Zs see no reasons to treat them any differently as the employee. Some Gen Zs, for example, simply refuse to work unpaid overtime or attend the after-work drinking events, choosing to prioritize their own work-life balance. Gen Zs are also more ready to quit their jobs. They're not super on board with this idea of lifelong employment in one company. So if they find their company to be bad for them, they'll leave. In other words, Gen Zs are acknowledging the invisible nature of this bond of culture, thereby breaking its spell in a way. This is kind of funny because, as we've discussed, Japanese employees work unpaid overtime, attend after-work drinking events, and stay in a company for life, mostly due to cultural reasons. In other words, there's no legal or contractual obligation to do these things most of the time. So when Gen Zs don't do these things, there's not much Japanese companies can do apart from complaining about them, and Japanese companies do complain about them. I was first made aware of this from a YouTube video titled Why Japanese Companies Hate Gen Zs. For example, some companies see Gen Zs as lazy, too sensitive, lacking team player spirits, and give up too quickly, referring to the frequency with which Gen Zs quit their jobs. Now, I'm sure some members of Gen Zs are indeed lazy and sensitive and give up quickly, as there are people like that in every generation. But as a whole, I see the changes Gen Zs are bringing into the Japanese workplace as largely positive. For example, this is good for getting rid of black companies, because one of the things that black companies rely on is this cultural premise of lifelong employment and group conformity. And this is one of the tools that allows them to treat their employees badly and get away with it. But when a black company does that to Gen Zs, they just quit. Now, that is not without difficulties. For example, managers in black companies can get quite aggressive when employees try to quit, sometimes downright refuse to accept their resignation or make threats with legal or financial consequences. This has given rise to a kind of service in Japan called Taishoku Daiko, which translates to job quitting service or resignation agencies. For a fee, these companies would help you quit your job on your behalf, and Gen Zs are popular users of such service. And looking into the future, we're currently living in a time in human history where things are changing so quickly that we can hardly predict what the world will look like 4 months from now. And this necessitates a level of agility for both employers and employees. Rigidly adhering to tradition might no longer be suitable for Japanese employers if they want to remain competitive in the global marketplace. By looking out for their own interest, Gen Zs are able to not only secure more career opportunities and work-life balance for themselves, but also increase the liquidity in the job market, keep employers on their best behaviors, and potentially make the Japanese economy more innovative and productive. Whether or not that will actually happen remains to be seen, but I'm optimistic.